So I'm going to just wait till people, I'm going to just encourage people to come in. You can start. Perfect.
Have they handed out the source sheet? Yes. Okay, great. So we'll give it about 1 minute. Get started? Okay. Hello, everyone. Let's get started. So hopefully everybody should have a copy of the source sheet. Yes, great. Okay, so here's the topic that I would like to discuss today. In general, we can make the following distinction between what we generally regard as history and what we regard as memory. The difference between history and memory, broadly speaking, is that history refers to our interest in the past as a unique set of events. We're interested in understanding people and places in their particular context, not in terms of what they mean to us in the present, but because we want to have some understanding of the past. When we talk about memory, memory is different from history in that memory is not interested in the past as kind of a separate entity. The past is important if we're within this framework of memory. The past is important because of how it informs the present, specifically how it informs our identity, how it informs our association with the community, how it informs our understanding of the present and the future. And it's what historians, Jewish historians and others refer to as collective memory when we're talking not about the relationship between the past and an individual, but the relationship between the past and a community. When a community wants to turn to the past in order to understand something about itself, in order to understand what it represents, how it's gotten to the present, and its vision for the future, when a community turns to the past for that purpose, then it's engaged in a study not of what we regard as history, but of what we regard as collective memory. What I want to do today is I want to look at the traditions about Bar Kokhba, and I'll introduce Bar Kokhba in a minute, traditions about Bar Kokhba and about his revolt, to demonstrate that in general, the importance of Bar Kokhba from antiquity through modernity has been less as a figure of history. Jews haven't really been interested in Bar Kokhba for something that he can tell us about the ancient world, or something that he can tell us about ancient Judaism. Jews have historically been interested in Bar Kokhba and the Bar Kokhba revolt because Bar Kokhba has something that he can teach us about our present condition, about the Jewish community, and about Jewish identity. Okay, so that's kind of where I want to go. In order to get there, we need to first understand something about who Bar Kokhba was, and what he stood for, and what this revolt of his was. Okay, so in order to get to Bar Kokhba, let's begin with the revolt against the Romans and the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash. Bar Kokhba's revolt takes place in the years 132 to 135 CE. And the background to it really is the destruction of the Beit HaMikdash in the year 70 CE. I spoke about this previously a couple of months ago when I addressed the topic of the menorah. Talked a little bit about the propaganda value of the revolt of the Jews against the Romans, propaganda value for the Roman emperors that followed that destruction. The sequence of emperors beginning with the destruction of the temple in the year 70 CE. Vespasian is the general who initially oversaw the response to the Jewish revolt. Jewish revolt begins in the year 66 CE. Vespasian becomes the emperor in the year 68 CE. His son Titus is left as the general to oversee the completion of the defeat of the Jews. Titus succeeds in defeating the Jews in the year 70. And Vespasian, his son Titus, and a second son Domitian have no real credentials, no legitimate claims to the throne of Emperor of Rome, have no legitimate credentials other than the fact that they oversaw the quelling of this major revolt by the Jews against Rome. And so what the family of Vespasian who rules up until the year 79, Titus who rules from 79 until 81, Domitian who rules from 81 to 96, the dates aren't important. What is important is understanding that within the first generation, this family of emperors did as much as they possibly could to capitalize on the defeat of the Jews in the year 70. Meaning the defeat of the Jews in the year 70 was not of tangential value. It was of central value, and that explains a number of important aspects of Roman life in Rome in the generation following the destruction of the temple. So, for example, the Roman emperors, Vespasian, Titus, and Domitian, built two arches of Titus, not just one. There's one surviving arch of Titus in the Roman Forum. There was a second arch of Titus that was located in the Circus Maximus at the opposite end of Rome. Circus Maximus is basically the spot where somebody arriving in Rome would have come directly into the circus and would have seen this massive arch directly confronting them. And so you had two arches built to celebrate the defeat of the Jews at opposite ends. That's relatively unprecedented to have two arches celebrating one victory. And it's not just that there were two arches celebrating this one victory, but the arches themselves, the surviving arch, was not actually built by Titus at all. Right? It's known as the Arch of Titus, but it was actually built by Titus's brother Domitian, the third member of that imperial family that I referred to before. Domitian rules from 81 to 96. 15 years after the destruction of the second Beit HaMikdash, he erects the Arch of Titus, which begs the question, why 15 years later is it of such importance to Domitian that he bothers to commemorate this event? And the answer is because this family had nothing to stake their claims to the imperial throne on other than the fact that they had defeated the Jews. So they build two arches. They build one of those arches 15 years after the destruction. They mint coins known as the Judea Capta coins that illustrate in a pictorial form, illustrate the defeat of the Jews. On these Judea Capta coins, the Roman soldier is pictured standing above the Jewish woman, represented as feminine. The Roman soldier is often portrayed holding a gladius, a small knife, in a very sexually suggestive way, suggesting that he's going to penetrate this Jewish woman. This represented for the Romans, this coin was basically propaganda, celebrating the defeat of the Jews in the year 70. The Judea Capta coins were also minted for a generation. All of those emperors within that family, Vespasian, Titus Domitian, minted coins that illustrated the defeat of the Jews for 25 years. Again, why is that? It's because this family required capitalizing on its defeat of the Jews in order to stake its claim to the throne. The Romans, immediately after the destruction, required that the Jews divert payment of the Machatzit HaShekel, this annual payment that was due to the Beit HaMikdash. Beginning with the destruction, the Romans required that Machatzit HaShekel be paid instead to the temple of Jupiter in Rome. That payment, which is known as the Fiscus Judaicus, also was something that was in place for 50 years after the destruction. Why is it that that would be in place for 50 years? Because, in fact, this was not, the defeat of the Jews was not of marginal importance. It was of central importance for the Romans. The Fiscus Judaicus was actually enforced with great brutality. There's actually a story that one of the Roman historians tells about an old man who claimed not to be Jewish, and instead of taking his word for it, the Roman emperor at that time, Domitian, required that he strip naked because he had to prove that he did not have a bris milah, right? Because this very modest payment that was due to the temple of Jupiter was, again, not economically important, but it was important for propaganda value. And so in all of these ways, the destruction of the temple was important not just as a loss for the Jews, but as an important gain. And that's why it's of essential significance to appreciate the fact that the Romans never again allowed the Jews to worship in their temple. In antiquity, the notion that you would have a god who you would serve, but would not offer sacrifices to, that notion doesn't exist. The only way of serving gods in antiquity were by serving them with sacrifices in their temple. So the idea that the Romans never allowed the Jews to once again rebuild the temple, we take it for granted. Of course, the Romans never allowed the Jews to rebuild the temple, but it's not immediately obvious why that wasn't the case. Why couldn't the Romans simply have destroyed the temple, imposed greater, for example, they could have brought in a second and third legion and housed them in Israel, which is something that they later do. Why not allow the Jews to rebuild the temple? Again, because this is of essential significance for the Romans. It wasn't only important, the destruction of the temple was not only important for the family that took over the throne beginning in the year 70, it was also important for the emperors that followed them. If we kind of move chronologically from the destruction of the temple in the year 70 to the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 132, after Domitian dies in the year 96, there are three more emperors that precede the outbreak of the revolt. Nerva is the emperor from the years 96 to 98, Trajan, the emperor from 98 to 117, Hadrian, the emperor beginning in 117. All three of them, they weren't from the family of the Flavian dynasty. They weren't in any way related to Vespasian and to his sons, but like Vespasian and his sons, they had no legitimate claim to the throne. What was their claim to the throne? Their only claim to the throne was that their ancestors, the preceding generation, had served in the siege against Jerusalem. And so they too required tapping into the defeat of the Jews in order to explain why it is that they had the credentials. And so they too for example, continued minting the Judaic capital coins. They too continued enforcing the Fiscus Judaicus, and they didn't allow the Jews to rebuild the temple because the destruction of the temple represented something important from a symbolic perspective. Yeah. Didn't he? Well, Julian is the one who allows the temple to, unless you have something else in mind. Julian is the one who allows the temple to. I think that's under Julian. Julian the Apostate in 361. That's the story that's told there. Is I think you're talking about Julian, yeah, in the year 361. Okay, so the question then is, why after 60 years, 62 years, did the Jews once again rebel against the Romans? What exactly sparked that rebellion? So there was actually a second rebellion that took place between the rebellion that resulted in the destruction of the temple in the year 70 and the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba revolt in the year 132. There was what's known as the Diaspora Revolt in the year 115. We actually know very little about this Diaspora Revolt. It's referred to in a couple of Roman sources. From what we can tell, it didn't actually extend into Israel. So the Diaspora Revolt against the Romans encompassed Cyrene, which is in northern Libya, the island of Cyprus, Egypt, parts of Mesopotamia, areas that were either under Roman control or that were reacting to Roman control. Jews in these areas rebelled against the Romans in the year 115 for reasons that aren't entirely clear, and some of the reasons might have been specific to each of those locations. But what is clear is that at least part of the universal reason for these rebellions, the Diaspora Revolt, is because of their hatred toward the Romans, their animosity, presumably in some way related to the fact that the Romans continued to oppress the Jews in the ways that I described for no apparent reason to the Jews. The Jews couldn't have understood why it was that the Romans weren't allowing them to rebuild the temple. The Jews couldn't have understood why it was that they continued having to pay the Fiscus Judaicus. All that they felt was the brunt of Roman animosity, and that seems to have provoked a second wave of rebellions in the year 115. The response to that in this Diaspora Revolt in the years 115 to 117 was the Romans began to clamp down on the Jews. Even though there's no evidence that there was fighting in Israel, as far as we can tell, this was really limited to the diaspora. The Romans sent a second legion of soldiers to Israel by the year 120, which means that even though Israel was not in any way involved in the second revolt, the Romans seem to have felt like disaffection among Jews in one part of the empire signaled disaffection among Jews in every part of the empire. And they seem to have understood there was a certain solidarity, so that if Jews in one area had rebelled, perhaps Jews in all areas were on the verge of rebelling. And so the Romans not only forbade the Jews from rebuilding, but they also clamped down on them by bringing in an entirely new legion of soldiers to Israel.
Is there any mention of this revolt in
the diaspora revolt?
Yeah, in the Talmud.
No. It's only in Roman sources that we hear about it. Yeah. Yeah, so there is, okay, so that's true. So there is this one reference to Pomos Kitus. The name of the general who was responsible for quelling the diaspora revolt was Lucius Quietus. He was subsequently sent to serve as governor over Israel. There's some question about whether Pomos Kitus, which is referred to, actually does signal the diaspora revolt. To the extent that it does, you're right, that would be one indication. So now Hadrian takes over as emperor in the year 117. I said that Trajan rules from 98 to 117. His nephew Hadrian relies on the propagandistic value of the rebellion, of the quelling of the rebellion back in 70, just as much as his predecessors had. But Hadrian doesn't seem to take a direct route to further responding to sort of Jewish animosity. What Hadrian does when he takes over as Roman emperor in the year 117 is he goes on a tour of the different provinces. He finally makes his way toward the Middle East in the year 130, but basically he makes his way, weaves his way through the different provinces. And each of the provinces, what he does is he institutes certain administrative, certain legal, economic, and political reforms that are unique to each of those provinces. He only makes his way to the Middle East in around the year 130. And finally, when he arrives in Israel in the year 130, this is his opportunity finally to deal with the Jewish problem that had been ongoing for 60 years and that apparently the Romans recognized was not a problem that was going to go away, which is why they brought in the Second Legion into Israel by the year 120. What Hadrian does is Hadrian in around the year 130 founds a city called Aelia Capitolina. Aelia was his family name. Capitolina for Jupiter Capitolinus, the god Jupiter, to whom the Jews had always paid this Machatzit HaShekel going back to the year 70. So a temple that is built to honor Jupiter on Har HaBayit, and a Roman colony that was founded using the names Aelia and Capitolina on Jerusalem, which in practical terms would have meant the Jews now would have been basically excluded from Rome, from Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been basically reestablished as a Roman colony. A Roman pagan colony. Now, obviously, this would have provoked the Jews, and it's hard to believe that Hadrian would not have known that this would provoke the Jews. And in order to understand why he would have undertaken such a provocative step, again, we need to place that step against the background of everything that I've described until now, namely what had taken place over the 60 years prior to that moment. What had taken place during those 60 years was a constant back and forth between the Jews and the Romans not in any way not withdrawing, but continuing to oppress the Jews in various ways, not permitting them to rebuild the temple, but instead capitalizing on the propagandistic value of the destruction of the temple. And by 130, it seems like the only possible course of action from the Roman perspective in order to definitively resolve the Jewish problem was to refound Jerusalem as a pagan colony so that the Jews would have no hope of ever rebuilding the temple. That seems to have been Hadrian's logic, because otherwise it's very hard to make sense of why it is that he takes those steps. Obviously, once that took place, the Jews were not going to stand idly by, and that's exactly what happens with the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba revolt in 132. As far as we can tell, the Bar Kokhba revolt was waged as a guerrilla war. So that's why if you visited the so-called Bar Kokhba caves in Israel, this was not waged as a war on an open battlefield. The Jews would retreat into their caves, they would emerge, engage in guerrilla warfare, and that's why this rebellion lasted for 3 years, because it seems like they were relatively successful. One of the sources that we're going to look at momentarily is the Roman historian Dio Cassius. Says that there were so many Roman casualties during the course of those 3 years that when Hadrian wrote to the Roman Senate at the end of the rebellion to report on what had taken place, he didn't use the typical greeting formulation that he would have, because he understood that this had not been a model of success, the way in which the Bar Kokhba revolt had been put down. Eventually, it is put down. The result of the Bar Kokhba revolt is twofold. The Hadrianic persecutions are instituted, and Jews were essentially expelled from Jerusalem going forward. That's what we know about the general trajectory of the Bar Kokhba revolt. What I want to do is, before we even get into the later sources themselves, I want to just look at a few sources that we have that we've recovered archaeologically that can tell us a little bit more about the trajectory of the Bar Kokhba revolt and who this person Bar Kokhba was. So turn to page 15 in the handout. The numbers are at the bottom of the pages. Before the discovery of what are known as the Bar Kokhba letters, we didn't actually even know the name of this person who was the leader of the rebellion. We'll see a text that seems to refer to him as Bar Kokhba. The only source that actually refers to him as Bar Kokhba is an early Christian source, as we'll see. When the rabbis refer to him, they refer to him exclusively as Bar Koziva, for reasons that we'll get to in a little bit. His name, it turns out, was actually Bar Kosba or Bar Kosiba, and we didn't know his first name until the discovery of Bar Kokhba coins and Bar Kokhba letters. His name was Shimon, so Shimon Bar Kosba. You can see that at the top of page 15. This is the text of one letter. The letters, we'll talk about this when we talk about the appropriation of Bar Kokhba in the modern Zionist context. The Zionist archaeologist who discovers the Bar Kokhba letters is named Yigal Yadin. This is one of the letters that he discovered. The letter opens, it's a letter that was written or at least attributed to the person who was responsible for this rebellion, Shimon Bar Kokhba Hanasi al Yisrael. Now, the reason he's referred to as Nasi, so we know a number of things about the word Nasi. Nasi appears in Sefer Yechezkel in the last number of prakim that describe this future, the third temple, the future temple in all of its glory. The ruler in this future eschatological temple is referred to as a Nasi. So it seems the Nasi, that term seems to signal a future political messianic leader. And so it might not be a coincidence that Bar Kokhba, this Shimon Bar Kokhba, has adopted the title of Nasi because it might suggest certain messianic overtones, perhaps. What you get in the course of this letter and other letters is a leader who is involved in the real nitty-gritty of the revolt. So he writes letters to the sort of regional generals that he's set up. These regional generals are known as Parnasim. He writes to these regional rulers about things that seem to be of very mundane interest. So if we just take a look at this one, let's read it in English. Shimon, son of Kokhba, the premier over Israel, to Yehonatan and to Misabala. Yehonatan and Misabala were two of these Parnasim. They're referred to in a number of other texts. You are ordered to examine and to seize the wheat that he brought, namely Chanuin, son of Ishmael, and ship of them to me, weighed precisely 1 sa'ah, and place them under guard because they were found to have been stolen. And if you do not do accordingly, know that from you punishment will be exacted. So Bar Kokhba, who is overseeing this massive rebellion against the Romans, is interested in procuring this amount of wheat that apparently had sort of been inappropriately shipped or had been hidden by the rebels. And so he writes to these local Parnasim in order to recover this wheat. That's not a sort of detail that we would expect somebody who is an effective delegator would do, and yet that's the sort of thing that we find in these letters. Bar Kokhba taking interest in really the very small details involved in administration and governance. If you turn to page 17, so at the same time that Bar Kokhba was interested in many of the real fine details of administration, there are a couple of letters in which he also seems to express some interest in the observance of halakha. This is one of the important letters. He writes to a different one of his Parnasim, Yehuda, son of Menashe. I have delivered to you 2 donkeys in order that you dispatch along with them 2 men to Yehonatan, son of Bayan, and to Misabala, in order that they pack up and deliver to the camp to you palm branches and citrons, lulavin ve'etrogin, and you are to send additional persons from your place, and let them bring you myrtle branches and willows. Right, so this is hadassin va'aravin. So he needs the daled minim, and so what does he do? He reaches out to his local Parnasim in areas where they have access to the daled minim, and this seems to be something of importance to Bar Kokhba. And so at the same time that he was a general, that he was a very hands-on governor, he was also somebody who was interested in the observance of halakha. One final important set of sources that we have about the historical Bar Kokhba are the Bar Kokhba coins. So if you continue a couple of pages later, these are the final sets of texts. Let's take a look at page 20. So what you see on these coins were important for Bar Kokhba, important for propaganda purposes. These coins, first of all, were overstruck on Roman coins. And so they would take Roman coins that had an image of the emperor and strike on them a number of different images. In some of the cases, the images seem to have been an image of the temple. So if you look at that top line, you can see under the word Yerushalayim, see what looks like an image of a building with columns. That seems to be an image of the temple. There is a reference on them. They're dated according to Shana Aleph L'Geulat Yisrael, Shana Bet L'Cherut Yisrael, the first year for the redemption of Israel, the second year for the freeing of Israel. These statements are in Hebrew, which is interesting. It's not simply that they express the aspiration for freedom, they're in Hebrew, which is important because the letters that we were looking at earlier were actually in Aramaic. And so this isn't the language that they're speaking at this time. So why are they writing them in Hebrew? Because what Bar Kokhba is trying to do is he's trying to recapture the glory days of the biblical past. And that's why these coins are not only written in Hebrew, but they're also written using the ancient Hebrew script. Ktav Ivri, you can see that on the periphery of some of these coins. Again, because what Bar Kokhba is trying to do is in this very visual way to represent his attempt to recapture the glory of the past. This is what we can say about Bar Kokhba the person on the basis of his coins, on the basis of his letters, on the basis of snippets of information that we can gather from Roman historians and early church historians, but not very much more. We have a lot more information about the first rebellion against the Romans, the rebellion that ultimately results in the destruction of the Second Temple, because we have the historian Josephus, who presents to us a description of that rebellion in great detail. We don't have a Josephus to chronicle this final rebellion of the Bar Kokhba rebellion, and so we're really dependent on snippets of information here and there. What are those snippets of information, in addition to the letters and the coins? So now let's turn to page 1. This first source is from the Roman historian Dio Cassius. Dio Cassius is a source that provides us some of the information that I shared earlier. At Jerusalem, Hadrian founded a city in the place of the one which had been razed to the ground, naming it Aelia Capitolina, and on the site of the temple of the god, he raised a new temple to Jupiter. This brought on a war of no slight importance nor of brief duration, for the Jews deemed it intolerable that foreign races should be settled in their city and foreign religious rites planted there. Just continue on to the next paragraph, the underlined portion. Soon, however, all Judea had been stirred up, and the Jews everywhere were showing signs of disturbance, were gathering together and giving evidence of great hostility to the Romans. It's important to just note that this rebellion probably didn't extend much beyond the region of Judea itself. We can make that determination really on the basis of the distribution of these Bar Kokhba coins. The Bar Kokhba coins were legal tender only in areas that were under Bar Kokhba's control. And those areas seem to have included only Judea, because those coins were found in massive quantities, but only in Judea. Almost no coins were found in the Galilee, and only 3 coins were found in Jerusalem, which suggests that Jerusalem remained under Roman control, which makes sense. It was a Roman colony, again, as I said before. And the Galilee seems to have not come under the control of Bar Kokhba. At the same time, the Galilee seems to have been prepared as kind of the next phase in this rebellion, which is why if you visit areas in the Galil, there are these Bar Kokhba caves that I described earlier. They are located in the Galilee, which suggests maybe the groundwork was being laid for an expansion of the rebellion that never actually took place. So Dio Cassius gives us a little bit of a window into what's taking place. We're going to look at 3 sets of sources, though, now that we have a little bit of a sense of what the historical Bar Kokhba looked like. I want to look at 3 sets of sources that turn to Bar Kokhba, not in order to understand the Bar Kokhba of history, but going back to my introduction, in order to understand something, the Bar Kokhba of memory. How is it that Bar Kokhba would have been relevant, would have in some way contributed to the production of identity on the part of later communities? People who were looking to the past, not in order to understand the past, but in order to inform them about their present and about the future. 3 sets of communities that did this with respect to the Bar Kokhba rebellion. The first we're going to talk about is the early Christian community. How did early Christian communities make sense of the Bar Kokhba revolt? Why was it of significance to them? The second is going to be the rabbis of antiquity, and the third is going to be the context of modern Zionism. Yeah, Joseph.
What is true and where is more myth or people taking history, changing it?
So, to a certain extent, the distinction between history and memory is somewhat artificial. We're always, in some ways, looking to the past through the lens of the present, right? But the difference really is in terms of objective. The sources that we're looking at, what I'm going to suggest is they weren't interested in understanding the Bar Kokhba of the past. They were interested in understanding what Bar Kokhba represented in terms of enduring and stable trends, enduring and stable ways in which God relates to the people. They weren't interested in the uniqueness of Bar Kokhba. The real defining difference between history and memory is whether the person who's studying the past is interested in the past's uniqueness or interested in the past's sort of how it stands for certain templates, certain repeating templates. Yeah.
That's what I'm saying. Let's say American historical terms.
Right.
So when you look at George Washington, look at the historical analysis of Washington through a lot of sources, or we can think of Washington chopping down the cherry tree, which speaks about a certain image of Washington that we like say that's what America is. Although once we get out of that school, we know that that's not true. So one thing is about Kokhba, memory.
The latter, is like the George Washington of lore. It's looking to George Washington because we want to understand him in a certain way. He's this important founding figure, and we're going to see Bar Kokhba is going to be described in similar terms in all of the sources that we're looking at. Okay, starting with the early Christian appropriation of Bar Kokhba. The question that ancient Christians and Jews had to deal with was why exactly the Bar Kokhba revolt failed. What did it signify? What does it tell us about God's relationship with the Jews? Now, obviously, the answer to that question was going to be different for Christians than for Jews. The sources that we're going to look at from ancient Christianity say that the reason that the Bar Kokhba revolt failed was because God had already rejected the Jews, because the Jews had repudiated Jesus, and this was sort of the nail in the coffin. The fact that the Bar Kokhba revolt was quelled by the Romans, the fact that the Jews were then exiled from Jerusalem definitively was God's definitive act of rejection. Okay, let's take a look at two sources that speak about Bar Kokhba in those terms. Again, not interested in Bar Kokhba, the person, Bar Kokhba, what motivated him to rebel, not questions that would interest us if we were interested in the uniqueness of this event, but rather what does it tell us about our Christian identity and about God's relationship with the Jews. So the first source that we're going to be looking at, which is at the bottom of page 2, is the church historian Eusebius of Caesarea. And Eusebius is really this is the other very important source for the story of Bar Kokhba, in addition to the source that we just looked at, the Roman historian Dio Cassius. Eusebius writes as follows. He says, the Jews were at that time led by a certain Bar Kokhbas, which means star. Now, he doesn't tell us why this person was referred to as a star, but what we'll see is that the Talmud Yerushalmi attributes to Rabbi Akiva the drasha that Bar Kokhba this person was a Mashiach because of the pasuk in Sefer Bamidbar, Darach Kochav Yaakov, a star has gone forth from Jacob, which had certain messianic overtones in antiquity. That seems to be why, according to Eusebius, Jews called this person Bar Kokhba, right? Because he either represented himself as or was understood by others to be a messianic figure inspired by that pasuk. And as I said before, this is the only source that actually refers to him as Bar Kokhba. That's how we refer to him, because until we discovered the Bar Kokhba letters, the Bar Kokhba coins, the only alternative to Bar Kokhba were the rabbinic sources, Bar Kokhbas. Obviously, within sort of Western civilization, this became the important source, Eusebius. So means star. He was a man who was murderous and a bandit, but relied on his name as if dealing with slaves, and claimed to be a luminary come from heaven and was magically enlightening those who were in misery. So you have this person who seems to have certain messianic overtones, but he's a messianic pretender. He's somebody who claimed to be the star, claimed to be this messianic figure, but he dealt with his followers in a very heavy-handed way. He dealt with them as if they were slaves, magically enlightening those who were in misery. Now, if we think about what this sounds like, who does Bar Kokhba, within the context of Eusebius, sound like? this messianic figure who is coming to enlighten those who are in misery, sent by God. He's the inverse of Jesus. So you have this messianic figure who's coming to preach to those who are in misery. But what's the difference between Jesus and Bar Kokhba? Bar Kokhba, in part, it's the way in which each of them deals with their followers. Bar Kokhba was a military man. He was somebody who, stood for raising arms against Rome. What was Jesus's message? Jesus's message, it was one of peace, right? This is, we're not going to raise, it was, render to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, and not raising arms against Caesar. He also was somebody who was sent to preach to the poor, but he wasn't a messianic pretender. He was the real thing, in contrast to Bar Kokhba, who was a messianic pretender. Continues, let's read the rest of Eusebius's passage at the bottom. Hadrian then commanded that by a legal decree and ordinances, the whole nation should be absolutely prevented from entering thenceforth even the district around Jerusalem, so that it could not even see from a distance its ancestral home. The outcome of this revolt was that the Jews were definitively exiled from Jerusalem. Why is that important for Eusebius? He goes on and says as follows: thus, when the city came to be bereft of the nation of the Jews, and its ancient inhabitants had completely perished, it was colonized by foreigners. And the Roman city, which afterwards arose, changed its name, and in honor of the reigning emperor Aelius Hadrian was called Aelia. The church too, it was composed of Gentiles, and after the Jewish bishops, the first who appointed to minister to those was Marcus. So what happens now that you have this messianic pretender, this heavy-handed messianic pretender, raised arms against the Romans, who instead of preaching the good news to the poor, instead oppressed the poor. Now that he has failed, the Jews have now been exiled, and what happens? The city now has been colonized by foreigners, by Gentiles. That's going to be significant to Eusebius, because for Eusebius, the Gentiles, the foreigners, are his Christian predecessors. And so this is now the definitive moment when God's loyalty, we can confirm, has shifted from the Jews to the Gentiles. Jerusalem is now no longer a Jewish city. Jerusalem is now a Roman city. Who are the Romans? The Romans are Gentiles, right? God now is on the side of the Romans. And it's therefore important to just observe that now we no longer have Jewish bishops. Now we finally have Gentile. Now we have Christian bishops. And so for Eusebius, the Bar Kokhba revolt is important not because of its historical value, but because it tells us something of enduring value about how God relates to both Christians and Jews. It's important because it tells us something about God's repudiation of the Jews and about God's embrace of the Christians. And that's why Eusebius, almost 200 years after the end of this revolt, is interested in speaking about it at all. We can confirm that for early Christians, the Bar Kokhba revolt was not of value for its kind of historical antiquarian interest, but because it meant something to Christian identity, from the next passage, which is from Justin Martyr. Justin Martyr is one of the early church writers in the 2nd century, and he too is dealing with the question of why was the Bar Kokhba revolt ultimately a failure. He writes as follows. This is from his work Dialogue with Trypho. Dialogue with Trypho is a contrived dialogue in which Justin Martyr engages a Jew named Trypho, basically in a sort of early disputation. And he says as follows to Trypho. He says, that you alone, you can read from the beginning, for the circumcision according to the flesh, which is from Abraham, was given for a sign, that you may be separated from other nations and from us, and that you alone may suffer that which you now justly suffer, and that your land may be desolate, and your cities burned with fire, and that strangers may eat your fruit in your presence, and not one of you may go up to Jerusalem. Skipping to the final sentence here, accordingly, these things have happened to you in fairness and justice, for you have slain the just one and his prophets before him. So Justin Martyr makes explicit the point that I was suggesting is implicit in Eusebius, namely that the way in which early Christians interpreted the failure of the Bar Kokhba revolt was that this signaled God's abandonment of the Christians and of the Jews, and now his new alignment with the Christians. So that's one way in which ancient people used the Bar Kokhba revolt not as important from a historical perspective, but more important in terms of constructing their identity, of understanding certain enduring messages going forward. Let's take a look at a couple of rabbinic sources, because obviously what the rabbis are going to say about the failure of the revolt is very different from what the ancient Christians will speak about. But what Chazal are doing here is Chazal are addressing the same question, namely, why exactly did the revolt ultimately fail? So let's turn to the source at the bottom of page 4. We're going to skip the Bavli. Let's turn to the source at the bottom of page 4, the Talmud Yerushalmi. Talmud Yerushalmi, let's date it to approximately the year 400 CE. The story that it tells starts with Rabbi Akiva. Tani Rabbi Shimon ben Yochai, bottom of page 4. Akiva Rabbi Hayad Doresh Darach Kokhab Miakov Darach Koziba Miakov. So Rabbi Akiva offered a drasha based on the pasuk that I referred to before. Darach Kochav Miakov, Sefer Bamidbar. This is one of the passages in Bilam's, the final passage of Bilam's bracha to the people, and he refers to a star going out from Jacob. According to Rabbi Akiva, this pasuk, which we know from other sources in antiquity, including the Dead Sea Scrolls, was understood to refer to the Mashiach. Rabbi Akiva used this to refer to our person of interest, Bar Kokhba. Now, the Yerushalmi refers to him as Bar Koziba. There are two possibilities for why that is. One possibility is that it's a pun. Koziba, like kazav. Kazav means falsehood or lie. And here the idea is Bar Koziba, real name is Bar Koziba. But for the rabbis, looking backward, now realize that he was, in fact, a false Mashiach. They don't refer to him by his actual name, Bar Kokhba or Bar Kosiba. They refer to him as Bar Koziba. Again, Kazav. That's one possibility. A second possibility, which is much more innocuous, is simply that you have the Zayin and the Samech simply sounding very similar, and so you end up with Bar Koziba. But we shouldn't make too much of the shift from the Zayin, from the Samech to the Zayin. That's the second possibility. In any case, Rabbi Akiva regards him as Mashiach. And that much becomes clear from the next sentence. Rabbi Akiva kad hava chamei bar kozba hava amar dein humaka mashiach. When Rabbi Akiva saw this bar koziba, he declared him to be Mashiach. Now, even before we continue, this is a fascinating beginning to this passage, because Rabbi Akiva's conclusion that bar koziba was the Mashiach was not because of anything that he had observed about Bar Koziba in the field. It's not that there was something about Bar Koziba that provoked Rabbi Akiva to declare him Mashiach. Why did Rabbi Akiva declare him Mashiach? Because of the drasha. The whole context for the rebellion within this sugya is going to be within the Beit Midrash. Rabbi Akiva's conclusion that Bar Koziba was a Mashiach was not by virtue of Bar Kokhba's charisma, not by virtue of something that Bar Koziba had done, but because Rabbi Akiva offered a drasha, and like other drashot, there are certain ramifications of that drasha, this one being that Bar Kokhba was a Mashiach. Now, that drasha is not going to be accepted by the other rabbis, and that's the response to Rabbi Akiva in the next sentence. Amarle Rabbi Yochanan bar Turta Akiva, Ya'alu asavim bilchayecha va'adayin ben David lo yavo. The response on the part of Rabbi Yochanan bar Turta is that Akiva, grass will grow from your jaws, and still David's son will not have come. So it's interesting that what you have here is you have basically a conventional machloket. We're familiar with these throughout rabbinic literature. You have one drasha here offered by Rabbi Akiva, and that drasha is going to be rejected by Rabbi Yochanan ben Turta. We haven't even actually seen Bar Koziba surface in this sugya at all. So just from the very outset, what Chazal are doing here is they are painting this rebellion in very rabbinic terms. Okay, let's continue. Gonna go down to about halfway down the page. The first word on the line is the word hayalot. In the English, gonna start with the words, there was Ben Koziba who had 200,000 with him. V'hayasham Ben Koziba v'hayalo 200,000 mitifei etzba. So you had 200,000 people who were missing a finger. The context here seems to be that one way in which Ben Koziba tested the courage of his men was by amputating them, right? Cutting off one of their fingers. And he had 2,000 such. Doesn't seem to be a very wise strategy for a soldier who wants to actually defeat the enemy. And of course, the rabbis come to him and point this out. Shalchu chachamim ve'amru lo. It's not other generals who come and point out Bar Kokhba's mistake. It's the other chachamim who say to him, Ad imatai ata useh Yisrael ba'alei mumin. For how long will you make Israel into defective persons? Now, what I said before is that the context for this rebellion within the sugya is entirely within the Beit Midrash. Just look at the way in which the language that Chazal are using also echoes the Beit Midrash. The way that they refer to these amputees is ba'alei mumin. Ba'alei mumin is a term of art within rabbinic halacha. Ba'alei mumin are blemishes on animals that render them unfit to be brought as sacrifices. And so here the idea is that when Chazal turn to Bar Kokhba and they speak about these people, they speak about them, they evaluate them in halachic terms. So again, all of this is being described within the context, within the framework of the Beit Midrash. Amar lahen v'chi heich efshar livod kan. Bar Kokhba responds to them and says, well, how am I supposed to test them if not amputating one of their fingers? Again, bodkan is important. Bidikat mumin. Once again, these are terms of art. Bar Kokhba is able to engage in halachic discourse with his rabbinic interlocutors. And not just that, but it's clear that he is in some way subservient to them. They're providing military advice. He says, well, how am I going to actually gauge their ability, if not amputate them? And they say, Amrulo, Kol mi she'eno rochev al suso v'oker erez min luvanon lo yiyeh niftav bi'isratya shalach. Anybody who cannot go on a horse and cannot uproot a cedar of Lebanon should not be enrolled in your army. And he discovers that there are 200,000 such people. 200,000 people who are amputees, 200,000 such people. What does that mean? It means that whereas Bar Kokhba was able to discover 200,000 people that he regarded as brave on the basis of amputating their fingers, what Chazal were able to do was to concoct a strategy that would allow him to find 200,000 genuinely brave, genuinely capable soldiers, people who were able to ride on horses and uproot cedars. There were 200,000 such people that Rabbi Akiva that Bar Kokhba overlooked, and he was only able to gain access to these 200,000 people because of the advice offered to him by Chazal. So Chazal are the originators of this idea that he's Mashiach. They then come to him to offer military advice, and the military advice seems to have been successful. So far in the context of this sugya, it seems like Bar Kokhba is actually a Talmid Chacham. He's literally a disciple of the sages. He listens to them, accepts their advice, and he benefits because of it. But the story sort of takes a downward turn from there. He goes out to the field. We'll read in the English just for the sake of efficiency here. When he went into battle, he said, Master of the world, do not support and do not hinder. It's just the quotes a pasuk from Tehillim Parak Samach, Psalm 60. Halo ata Elohim zinachtanu v'lo teitzei b'tzivotenu. Do not support and do not hinder. And he quotes a pasuk from Tehillim Parak Samach. Do not neglect us and do not go out with our armies. Which, according to Bar Kokhba, means I don't want you to help us. Don't get involved. Now, what's interesting is this is now Bar Kokhba making his own drasha. His drasha on this pasuk is, this pasuk, God instructs you to remain a neutral observer in this battle between us and the Romans. But this is actually an incorrect drasha on the pasuk. If you look in Tehillim Parak Samach, in Psalm 60 originally, this pasuk actually is used to, the author of that parak is reaching out to God and entreating God for help. Meaning, if you invoke this pasuk, what Bar Kokhba should be doing is asking God for help, because in context, that's what this pasuk actually means. So what Bar Kokhba is doing is Bar Kokhba is being Doresha Pasuk, but he's clearly a bad rabbi. He's a rabbi who doesn't know how to do drasha well. So in the beginning of the story, whereas he's a Talmid Chacham, he is subservient to the rabbis, he listens to them, he's able to engage with them in halachic discourse. As the story goes on, Bar Kokhba begins to show himself a somewhat incapable rabbi, a somewhat defective rabbi. Okay, 3.5 years, Hadrian encircles Beitar. Rabbi Elazar from Modi'in was sitting in sackcloth and ashes, praying every day and saying, Master of the world, Do not sit in judgment today. Do not sit in judgment today. So you have all of a sudden introduced into the story, not just Rabbi Akiva, who is on Bar Kokhba's side, but you have this person, Rabbi Elazar HaModai. Hadrian wanted to go away. A Samaritan said to him, do not go away, for I am seeing what to do that the city will submit to you. So a Samaritan in the context of this sugya, the arch rival of the Jew, goes to Hadrian and says, I know how to deliver the city to you. He went to the city gate, entered, and found Rabbi Elazar from Modi'in standing in prayer. He showed himself as if he would whisper into his ear. The people of the city saw him and brought him to Ben Kokhba. They said to him, we saw this old man turning to your uncle. So in fact, the Samaritan and Rabbi Elazar HaModai didn't actually exchange words, but it looked like they had. And so the followers of Bar Kokhba then go to him and say, we saw this old man, this Samaritan, speaking to your uncle, Rabbi Elazar HaModai. He says to them, what did you say to him? And what did he say to you? This is what Bar Kokhba says to Rabbi Elazar HaModai. Sorry, this is what Bar Kokhba says to the Samaritan. He goes to the Samaritan and says, what words did you exchange with my uncle? He answered, the Samaritan says to Bar Kokhba, if I shall tell you, the king will kill me. King Hadrian will kill me. But if I do not tell you, you will kill me. It is better that the king should kill me, but not you. So therefore, I'm going to tell you what he said, because that way you won't kill me, that way the king will kill me. So what did Rabbi Elazar HaModai say? He said to me, I will make the town submit to the king. He claims that Rabbi Elazar HaModai was ready to betray the town, which of course Rabbi Elazar HaModai was not. Rabbi Elazar HaModai spent every day for 3.5 years praying to God. But this is how the Samaritan is going to deliver the city over to Hadrian. What happens next? Bar Kokhba goes to Rabbi Elazar HaModai and he asks him, what did this Samaritan say to you? He answered, nothing. What did you say to him? He answered, nothing. He kicked him and killed him. So Bar Kokhba kills Rabbi Elazar HaModai because he doesn't believe Rabbi Elazar HaModai. He believes the Samaritan instead. And at that moment, that now is the death knell in the rebellion, because now God will abandon the Jews and deliver them over into the hands of Hadrian. Immediately there came an unembodied voice and said, woe, criminal shepherds who abandon the flock, a sword on his arm and on his right eye. His arm shall dry up and his right eye darken. You killed Rabbi Elazar HaModai, the arm of Israel, and their right eye. Therefore, this man's arm shall dry up and his right eye darken. Immediately, Beitar was taken and Ben Kokhba killed. They came carrying his head to Hadrian. He asked them, who killed him? A Samaritan said to him, I killed him. He said to him, show me his body. He showed him his body. He found a poisonous snake wrapped around him. He said, if God had not killed him, who could kill him? He recited over him, if not that their rock had sold them, and the Eternal handed them over. Pasuk from Devarim, Perek Lamed Bet, Lo ki tzuram necharam v'Hashem iskiram. Now, what is the story that Chazal tell about the Bar Kokhba revolt? It really is a story of a slowly deteriorating cycle of events, whereby Bar Kokhba starts out as a disciple of the sages. He starts out as somebody who recognizes the supremacy of Chazal, recognizes their authority over him, therefore takes their advice and solicits it. But slowly things deteriorate from there. He turns to God, incorrectly interprets a pasuk as meaning that God should remain neutral, and in the end actually kills the one person who had managed to keep Beitar afloat, this Rabbi Elazar HaModai. And so if Chazal are turning to the story of Bar Kokhba and asking, why did Bar Kokhba fail? Why did this revolt fail? Why didn't God deliver to us Hadrian? Why weren't we successful? The answer is because messianism within the community of Chazal, messianism can only take place from within the rabbinic community. The rabbis are the ones who inform us about when Mashiach is coming. The rabbis are the ones who essentially have the message about when Mashiach is here and how we should respond to claims of messianism. Now, Rabbi Akiva thinks that the time for Mashiach has arrived. He arrives at that conclusion on the basis of halachic discourse, on the basis of a drasha. The response is that he was incorrect, again, within the context of the Beit Midrash. And the reason that Bar Kokhba ends up being this false Mashiach is not because he had to be a false Mashiach. right? But it sounds like it's because he abandoned his alignment with Chazal, and as soon as he abandoned his alignment with Chazal, the possibility of success disappeared. And so their understanding of why Bar Kokhba failed is obviously very different. It doesn't signify God's definitive abandonment of the Jews. What it does signify is that Messianism will only prosper from within the rabbinic community and according to rabbinic guidance. That's the second kind of response to the Bar Kokhba revolt. Very quickly, I want to go through a third appropriation of the story of Bar Kokhba, and that's shifting forward about 1400 years from where we just left off to the context of modern Zionism. Now, Jewish antiquity is of great significance to Zionist historiography because the story that the Zionists wanted to tell was basically one in which what the Zionists are doing is recapturing the glory of the Second Temple period, the glory of the past before the Jews were sent into exile. Because what exile signified for the Zionists was Jewish weakness, was Jews simply going like sheep to the slaughter, was Jews unwilling and incapable of fighting back against their oppressors. What the Zionists were doing was precisely recapturing the glory of the past when the Jews did raise arms, when the Jews did respond, when the Jews tried to empower themselves against their foreign oppressors. And therefore, stories like Masada and Bar Kokhba became extremely significant, not because of the end of those stories. What we just saw in the cases of early Christianity and Chazal is that it was the end of the story that was significant for both Christians and Jews. What was significant for Zionist historians was the beginning of the rebellion. The very fact that the Jews had the temerity to raise arms against the Romans and that they did so with power, even if they failed. But the fact is that what the Zionists are trying to do is to recapture that spirit of independence from Bar Kokhba. You can see that in a number of places. Jump ahead to page 11. So Yigal Yadin, I said before, was the person who first discovered the Bar Kokhba letters. And there's a very dramatic moment that he recounts in his book called Bar Kokhba, in which he presents the letters, the Bar Kokhba letters that we briefly looked at earlier. He presents them to President Yitzhak Ben Zvi, the first president of Israel. And the story, the image is as follows. He says, a screen had been erected at Mr. Ben Zvi's house. And when my turn came to report, I projected onto the screen through a film slide the colored photograph of part of a document and read out aloud the first line of writing upon it. This is the letter that we looked at before. Shimon ben Kokhba, president over Israel, Nasi Israel. And turning to our head of state, I said, Your Excellency, I am honored to be able to tell you that we have discovered 15 dispatches written or dictated by the last president of ancient Israel 1800 years ago. A line is being connected by Yigal Yadin between the last Nasi, between Bar Kokhba, and the first Nasi in the modern Zionist context, Yitzhak Ben Zvi. And this is precisely because what Yigal Yadin is trying to do is to skip over 1800 years of exile and say that we as Zionists are trying to recapture that fierce spirit of independence that was illustrated by Bar Kokhba. And that's made explicit in the passage below from Ben Gurion in 1948. He says, the chain that was broken in the days of Shimon Bar Kokhba and Akiva ben Yosef was reinforced in our days. And the Israeli army is again ready for the battle in its own land to fight for the freedom of the nation and the homeland. Again, making that connection between modernity and antiquity explicit. Take a look at the last source on page 13, and with this we'll close. This also illustrates the way in which the Zionist appropriation of Bar Kokhba is so different from the way that Chazal speak about Bar Kokhba. This is for a brochure for Lag BaOmer. Now, Lag BaOmer is the day on which in Israel they commemorate the revolt of Bar Kokhba. Why is it Lag BaOmer? So we know Lag BaOmer represents two things within the Jewish tradition. It's the day, it's traditionally known as the day of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's Yartzeit, and it's also the day on which the students of Rabbi Akiva stopped dying, right? 33 days, Lag BaOmer is the final day. what does it have to do with the Bar Kokhba revolt? So what the modern Zionists did was they said that the story about Bar Kokhba, about Rabbi Akiva's students dying after 33 days, really allegorically alludes to the rebellion. It doesn't refer to his students dying of natural causes. It actually refers very subtly to the Roman oppression of the Jews, to the Roman destruction of the Jews, which stops on the 33rd day. What is the 33rd day? The 33rd day is the outbreak of the Bar Kokhba. And that's why Lag BaOmer becomes the celebration, day of commemoration of the Bar Kokhba revolt within the modern context. What they've done is they have, and that's significant because what they've done is they've shifted a day that was of great importance within the rabbinic context, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, Rabbi Akiva, and it's now about not the rabbinic community, but about the military conquest, soldiers, these proto-Zionists. Not just that, but what they do in associating Bar Kokhba with Lag BaOmer, of course, is that Bar Kokhba is no longer associated with Tisha B'Av, which is when we commemorate the story of Bar Kokhba. In commemorating the revolt of Bar Kokhba on Tisha B'Av, what we are commemorating is the defeat of Bar Kokhba, is the end, is the destruction, right? Which was what Chazal were concerned with. Why exactly was it that Bar Kokhba lost? In commemorating the Bar Kokhba revolt on Lag BaOmer, what the Zionists are doing is celebrating the outbreak of the revolt, the spirit of independence that provoked Bar Kokhba to raise arms in the first place. And you can see that in this text. This is a brochure published by the Ministry of Education in 1987. The Zionist movement considered the holidays of a central national significance and therefore added to them values that it regarded as important. Lag BaOmer was among other holidays that the Zionist movement cherished, since it was associated in the folks' minds with a revolt that had combined spiritual and physical heroism. Hence, the Zionist movement turns it into a holiday that promotes national values, the struggle for freedom, the military heroism, and the hope for redemption. But no different than ancient Christians and Chazal, what modern Zionists are doing is turning to the past, not because they're interested in Bar Kokhba, this unique individual. What they're doing is they're using Bar Kokhba as a template for understanding their present and for guiding their future. In this case, what they're interested in is understanding the fierce spirit of independence that provoked the revolt to break out in the first place. In the context of ancient Christianity and Chazal, what they were interested in is understanding the significance of the end of the revolt and what that signifies about God's presence in their day and what it signifies about God's presence going forward. But in all three contexts, as different as they are, as different as they use Bar Kokhba, still all of them are engaged in the same sort of process, making sense of the past in order to tell them something about their identity, in order to engage in the process of what I referred to earlier as an excavation of memory rather than a history. Thank you very much. We'll break. Just let everybody is free to leave, and I'm happy to stay and answer questions. Leah, do you want me to log off?